Most people think a stocked pantry means a safe pantry. They are completely wrong, and by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why. You have seen it. Someone catches a headline about inflation or hears a neighbor talking about shortages, and the next morning they are in the grocery aisle tossing random cans into a cart. Soup nobody asked for, green beans the kids refuse to eat, some pasta sauce from a brand they have never cooked with before. They get home, line everything up on a shelf, and feel like they did something smart. They did not. They bought a pile of disconnected calories with no plan behind them. That is not preparation. That is the illusion of preparation, and there is a dangerous gap between those two things. What you actually need is a shelf with a strategy. Every can on that shelf should have a job. It should fill a nutritional gap, extend another ingredient, improve the flavor of something plain, or serve a specific role in a real meal. If a can cannot answer the question of what it does for your cooking, it probably does not belong in a serious pantry. This video is not built on recycled advice from outdated forums. Everything covered here is connected to what is actually happening in the food supply right now. Real production data, real crop assessments, real industry forecasts pointing toward tighter availability and higher prices across multiple categories simultaneously. These are not vague warnings. They are specific signals, and they are worth understanding before the effects hit your grocery bill in full force. The 10 categories on this list do serious work. They stretch meals, close nutritional gaps, and make your other pantry staples more useful. Let's go through each one with full context on why it matters and what the market is telling you right now. Starting with canned tomatoes. Tomatoes come first, and they come first by a significant margin, not because they are the flashiest item or the most nutrient-dense option, but because they are the foundation that makes everything else edible. Think about what a real pantry eating situation actually looks like. You have rice, you have dried beans, you have pasta, maybe some canned meat and a few other basics. Calories are covered, but here's the problem most people do not realize until they are already in it. Calories without flavor stop feeling like food very quickly. You can survive on plain rice and beans. You will not enjoy it, and after a few days you will start skipping meals because the experience of eating has become something you are trying to avoid rather than something that restores you. Tomatoes solve that problem at the root level. A can of crushed tomatoes turns a pot of plain rice and beans into something that genuinely tastes like dinner. Diced tomatoes added to chicken and pasta create a dish worth sitting down to. Tomato paste, which is simply tomatoes cooked down and concentrated into a small tin, is one of the most efficient flavor tools on any grocery shelf. 2 tablespoons of that product transforms the entire character of a sauce, a braise, or a soup base without demanding much space or much money. That is what tomatoes actually do in a pantry context. They are not the centerpiece, they are the ingredient that makes every other ingredient worth eating. Without them, you have a shelf that is technically stocked, but practically demoralizing to cook from day after day. Now here's where the market picture becomes genuinely important. The timing around canned tomatoes right now is bad in a way that most casual shoppers have not registered yet. Florida took a significant hit from freezing temperatures during a critical window of the growing season. The damage assessment placed losses at roughly 80% across nearly 28,000 acres, and the worst part is that most of the season was still ahead when those numbers were calculated. That is not a minor disruption. That is a major production category getting heavily damaged exactly when it should be running at full output. Live market data from late March shows overall tomato supplies trending lighter across both coasts, with prices already moving upward in response to that tightening. Then you look at the processed side, the California operations responsible for turning field tomatoes into the sauce, paste, and diced product on grocery shelves. USDA figures show California processors are planning to contract approximately 9.8 million tons for the coming season. That number sounds substantial until you realize it represents an 11% drop from earlier forecasts, with contracted acreage down roughly 10% as well. The processors are planning to produce less, the fresh crop is already damaged, current supplies are running tighter. Put all three of those signals together, and canned tomatoes shift from being an ordinary pantry item to being something worth locking down now, before promotional deals weaken and shelf depth starts thinning out. Pick up whole, diced, crushed, sauce, and paste. Each format solves a different cooking problem. Whole and diced provide texture and body. Crushed and sauce move fast into soups and skillet meals. Paste gives depth and richness for very little cost. If you only prioritize one canned category before conditions become more expensive and uneven, make it this one. Nothing else on this list makes as many other foods better. Can we talk about something most prepper lists completely ignore? It is not just what you store. It is how those items work together under real cooking conditions. Keep that in mind as we move through the rest of this list. Moving to canned beans. After tomatoes, beans are the next foundation. This is where you build the protein and calorie base that genuinely keeps people fed when fresh grocery options become unreliable or unaffordable. And when this list refers to beans, it means the substantial ones: black beans, pinto beans, kidney beans, cannellini beans, chickpeas, the varieties that fill you up, provide protein and fiber, and turn a half-stocked pantry into something capable of feeding a household through a difficult stretch. These cans have been sustaining people through hard times for generations. They deserve more strategic respect than they typically receive in most preparedness discussions. The supply story around beans is quieter than the tomato story, but quiet does not mean minor. In many ways, the quiet signals are the ones worth watching most carefully, because they tend to catch people unprepared precisely because they were not dramatic enough to generate headlines. USDA data from the previous year shows that domestic dry edible bean production dropped 14% from the year before. Planted area was down 11%. Harvested area was down 11%. Yield declined as well. Every metric in that picture is moving in the same direction at the same time. Then the drought report from early this year added another layer. Drought coverage across the continental United States jumped from 43% to 55% in just 5 weeks. The most severe drought categories more than doubled in that window. The plains, the South, and significant parts of the Midwest all showed worsening conditions. Beans are exactly the kind of crop grown in those regions, and exactly the kind of crop that suffers when drought tightens its grip during key growing windows. This does not show up as empty shelves the morning after a bad weather report. That is not how this kind of pressure works. What actually happens is more gradual and more frustrating. The store brand disappears first. The most popular sizes become inconsistent. The price gap between a sale price and a full price stretches wider. You go looking for black beans, and the shelf has kidney beans, but not what you actually cook with. That is a slow supply squeeze in real life. It does not announce itself. It just quietly makes your pantry less reliable over time. From a preparedness standpoint, canned beans are one of the highest value places to invest. They are already cooked. They require no long simmering time or additional fuel. They need no refrigeration and no freezer. They function perfectly during a power outage. They pair naturally with nearly everything else on this list: tomatoes, corn, chicken, fish, whatever the meal requires. A can of beans combined with tomatoes and corn is already a complete meal base. That is genuine value, not theoretical preparedness. They also allow people to keep eating in a way that feels normal, rather than like emergency rations. And that psychological element matters more than most preparedness content ever acknowledges. Here's a question worth sitting with. When was the last time you looked at your pantry and asked whether your stored food actually forms real meals or just a collection of ingredients that happen to be shelf-stable? That distinction changes everything about how you stock. Now, canned sweet corn. This is a can that gets consistently underestimated, and the timing of that underestimation is particularly poor given what is happening in the market right now.
The same Florida freeze event that devastated the tomato crop hit sweet corn even harder. The damage assessment on approximately 45,000 affected acres came back at 100% losses. 100%! And at the time that figure was recorded, roughly 83% of the growing season was still ahead. That is not a partial setback or a manageable dip in production. That is an entire crop category being effectively eliminated from a major growing region during a critical supply window. Corn brings more to a pantry than most people realize.
It provides texture contrast that becomes increasingly important when you are eating from a shelf for an extended period. It adds natural sweetness that makes savory dishes feel more complete. It pairs well with beans, tomatoes, chicken, and fish without requiring any complicated preparation. It also provides a carbohydrate source that is distinct from pasta or rice, which helps with the meal variety problem that makes extended pantry eating difficult to sustain. Given the crop damage picture and the supply tightening currently underway, the case for stocking corn before availability becomes inconsistent is straightforward. It is inexpensive, useful, and genuinely difficult to replace with something equally simple once it becomes harder to find. On to canned chicken. Here is the protein source that divides people most sharply in preparedness conversations. Some people love it. Some people find the texture off-putting compared to fresh chicken. But under realistic pantry conditions, canned chicken earns its place because of what it delivers when alternatives are unavailable or too expensive. It is fully cooked. It opens and serves immediately. It works in soups, pasta dishes, grain bowls, wraps, and improvised salads. It requires no refrigeration before opening and no cooking time beyond warming. When fresh protein is unreliable or costly, a shelf of canned chicken means meals stay complete without requiring a different system. The market signals behind canned chicken are significant. Avian influenza has been moving through commercial poultry flocks with considerable impact on production levels. Egg prices captured most of the public attention, but the pressure on poultry meat supply runs parallel. When flock sizes decline and processing volumes tighten, the cost of the finished canned product follows. Prices on canned chicken had been climbing, and the trajectory is not pointing toward relief in the near term. If you have been waiting to stock chicken because the price seemed high, waiting longer is unlikely to improve the situation. Current pricing, while elevated relative to recent years, may look reasonable compared to where prices move as supply constraints continue to work through the system. Next is canned tuna. Tuna is the most familiar protein on this list for most households. It is affordable, widely available, protein-dense, and shelf-stable for extended periods. Most people already buy it occasionally. The difference between buying it occasionally and buying it strategically is the difference between having a few cans when needed and having a genuine protein reserve that covers multiple scenarios. What makes tuna particularly valuable in a preparedness context is its versatility combined with its speed. It requires no cooking. It works cold straight from the can, which matters when cooking fuel or cooking conditions are limited. It mixes easily with other pantry staples, tomatoes, beans, pasta, corn, whatever's available. It does not require elaborate preparation to produce something worth eating. The supply story around tuna involves a combination of global fishing pressure, climate-driven shifts in fish migration patterns, and ongoing increases in shipping and processing costs. None of these pressures are resolving quickly. They've been building gradually over several years, and they're contributing to a slow upward trend in pricing that shows no clear reversal signal. Albacore and light tuna behave as separate products in terms of pricing and availability, so stocking both provides coverage if one category becomes particularly tight or expensive. Both have a place in a well-built pantry. Something worth asking yourself here: are you stocking items because they are familiar and cheap, or because they actually solve your cooking problems under real conditions? The answer to that question should be driving every purchasing decision on this list. Moving to canned salmon. Salmon is the most nutritionally dense protein source on this list, and it's the one most people overlook when building a preparedness pantry. The nutritional profile is exceptional.
high protein content, significant omega-3 fatty acid content, a meaningful calcium contribution from the soft, edible bones included in most canned varieties. Vitamin D, B vitamins, these are nutrients that are difficult to maintain from a shelf-stable pantry built primarily around rice, beans, and pasta. Extended periods of pantry eating tend to create specific micronutrient gaps. The omega-3 and vitamin D content of canned salmon directly addresses some of the most common ones. That is not a minor consideration when you're thinking about maintaining physical and mental function through a difficult stretch. The supply pressure on canned salmon is real, and it is connected to specific, documented causes.
Wild Pacific salmon populations have been under sustained pressure from a combination of climate-related ocean temperature shifts, habitat changes in spawning rivers, and commercial fishing regulation adjustments responding to population data. Alaska sockeye, which is the primary source for most canned salmon on U.S. shelves, has seen significant catch variation year to year, with recent seasons coming in below historical averages. That variability translates directly to price instability and periodic availability gaps at the retail level. The long-term trend on salmon pricing is upward, and there is no clear signal that the fundamental supply pressures are easing. For a pantry designed to maintain genuine nutritional coverage through an extended difficult period, salmon earns a spot that few other canned proteins can match. Stock it now while pricing, though elevated, has not yet moved to the upper end of its likely range. Canned peaches. This one often surprises people when it appears on a serious preparedness list. The assumption is that fruit is a nice extra rather than a core pantry item. That assumption reflects a misunderstanding of what extended pantry eating actually does to people psychologically and nutritionally. Morale matters during difficult situations. This is not a soft consideration, it is a practical one. When every meal tastes the same, when there is no sweetness, no variety, no sensory relief from the monotony of beans and rice and canned protein, people start eating less. They skip meals, they stop preparing food carefully. Their nutritional intake declines, not because the food is unavailable, but because the experience of eating has become something they are trying to minimize. Canned peaches solve a specific part of that problem. They provide sweetness. They provide a completely different flavor and texture profile from everything else in this list. They work as a standalone snack, as a side alongside a savory meal, as an addition to oatmeal, or as a simple dessert that reminds people that food can still be enjoyable even under difficult conditions. That psychological function has direct practical consequences for how well people maintain their nutritional intake over time. The fruit and vegetable supply chain is also facing its own set of pressures. Orchard crops are sensitive to early season temperature fluctuations, water availability during growing periods, and labor conditions during harvest windows. Several of these factors have been trending negatively across major domestic growing regions. When fresh fruit prices spike or availability becomes inconsistent, canned alternatives become the backstop. Being positioned before that shift happens, rather than scrambling during it, is the entire point of building this kind of pantry deliberately and in advance. Here is the broader question this video keeps returning to. Are you building a pantry that keeps you fed, or one that keeps you comfortable and genuinely functional? The nutritional and morale gaps are just as real as the calorie gaps, and they require just as much deliberate planning to address. Canned coconut milk. This item appears on very few preparedness lists, and its absence from those lists is a significant oversight. Canned coconut milk is one of the most versatile, calorie-dense, shelf-stable items you can add to a serious pantry. Most people think of it exclusively as an ingredient for a specific recipe type. That framing dramatically undersells what it actually offers. Fat is a critical macronutrient, particularly during periods of physical stress, elevated activity, or extended time on a limited diet. Canned coconut milk delivers substantial fat content in a form that is completely shelf-stable, requires no refrigeration, and opens up an enormous range of cooking applications. Soups, stews, rice dishes cooked in coconut milk instead of water, oatmeal with a completely different character, improvised sauces,
simple preparations that require no heat at all. It transforms the flavor profile of almost anything it is added to, which means it directly addresses the monotony problem that makes extended pantry eating difficult to sustain. It also functions as a dairy substitute in cooking when fresh milk is unavailable or expensive. Thinned with water, it performs reasonably well in most applications that call for regular milk. Full-fat versions enrich dishes that feel thin or unsatisfying on their own. The coconut supply chain faces its own pressures. Major producing regions in Southeast Asia experience climate events that affect yields with meaningful regularity. Shipping costs have a significant impact on a product that travels a long distance to reach U.S. shelves. Prices have been increasing, and the trend line is not pointing toward relief.
From a pure value per shelf space perspective, full-fat canned coconut milk earns its position by adding caloric density, cooking versatility, and flavor range that very few single-can products can match. A serious pantry has room for it. Canned pumpkin. Consider this one carefully before moving past it, because it solves a specific and underappreciated problem that most pantry plans leave completely unaddressed. Canned pumpkin, and this refers strictly to pure cooked pumpkin rather than pre-sweetened pie filling, is one of the most micronutrient-dense shelf-stable items available in most grocery stores. A single cup provides meaningful fiber, potassium, vitamin A, and a range of other micronutrients that are genuinely difficult to source from a pantry built primarily around rice, pasta, beans, and canned protein. When you are eating from stored food for an extended period, micronutrient gaps accumulate faster than most people anticipate. The visible effects are not immediate, but over weeks and months, nutritional imbalances affect energy levels, immune function, mood stability, and physical performance in ways that compound and become harder to manage as time goes on. Canned pumpkin addresses that gap at a very low cost with excellent shelf stability. It also integrates into other foods without demanding major recipe adjustments. Add it to soups or stews for body and nutrition. Stir it into oatmeal without significantly changing the flavor. Use it in pasta sauces as a thickener that also adds nutritional value. It disappears into dishes while quietly making them more complete from a micronutrient standpoint. The U.S. pumpkin processing market is heavily concentrated geographically. One state produces the majority of the processing pumpkins used for canned product, which means a single bad growing season in that region affects availability and pricing with very little buffer from alternative sources. Climate variability has made yields less predictable in recent years. Processing capacity is limited to a small number of large facilities, which adds further fragility to the supply chain. It is not the most dramatic item on this list, but it does real nutritional work in a gap that most emergency pantries leave wide open, and it does that work cheaply and reliably. It belongs in the rotation. And the final item is canned broth and stock. This is the item that ties everything else on this list together, literally and functionally. Canned or cartoned broth, whether chicken, beef, or vegetable, is the liquid infrastructure of serious pantry cooking. Think about what actually transforms a collection of shelf-stable ingredients into something that tastes like a real meal. You have your protein cans, you have beans, you have tomatoes, you have vegetables and fruit. All of those ingredients exist independently, but the medium you cook them in determines whether the finished dish feels like food or like fuel. Cooking rice in chicken broth instead of plain water changes the character of that dish entirely. Simmering beans in broth instead of water produces something that tastes considered and satisfying, rather than functional and basic. Adding broth to a tomato-based soup gives it depth and body that elevates the entire eating experience. These are not minor improvements. Over days and weeks of pantry eating, they represent the difference between maintaining normal eating habits and gradually abandoning careful food preparation because nothing feels worth the effort anymore. Broth is also the foundation of actual soup, which is one of the most strategically valuable food categories in a serious pantry. Soup stretches limited ingredients.
It accommodates imperfect combinations of whatever's available. It requires minimal cooking fuel relative to the volume it produces. It is easy to eat when illness or stress has diminished someone's appetite. It is forgiving, flexible, and deeply useful. The supply signals around broth vary by type. Poultry broth is connected to the same avian influenza pressures affecting canned chicken. Beef broth is moving with the broader cattle market, where domestic inventory is sitting at multi-decade lows and prices are elevated across all beef categories as a result. Vegetable broth is the most supply stable of the three, but prices have moved upward with general commodity cost increases. Across all three varieties, the direction of travel is toward higher costs over time, not lower. Buy broth now and store it in volume. Cartons are often more space efficient than individual cans for storage purposes. Low-sodium versions give you more control over the salt content of your cooking, which matters when you're combining multiple salty ingredients like canned beans, canned vegetables, and canned protein in a single dish. A pantry without broth will produce edible food. It will not consistently produce satisfying food.
And that distinction between food you eat because you have to and food you actually want to eat determines whether people maintain their nutritional intake and their routines during a genuinely difficult period, or whether they start cutting corners because the cooking stopped feeling worthwhile. Here is the straightforward summary of everything this list represents. Most pantries fail not because they run out of calories, but because they were built without a system. People buy whatever is on sale or whatever loosely resembles survival food, and they end up with a collection of items that do not work together, do not address nutritional gaps, and will not rotate naturally through regular cooking before expiration dates become a problem. The 10 categories covered here form an actual system. Tomatoes make everything else edible. Beans, chicken, tuna, and salmon provide protein across multiple flavor profiles and multiple cooking applications. Corn adds texture, sweetness, and caloric variety. Peaches and pumpkin address the nutritional and morale gaps that always appear during extended pantry eating. Coconut milk contributes fat, versatility, and the ability to transform the flavor of almost any dish it enters. Broth ties all of it together into real meals rather than assembled ingredients sitting in bowls. Every item on this list is also backed by a real, documented market signal occurring right now, not vague anxiety borrowed from recycled preparedness content, actual production data, actual crop damage assessments, actual industry forecasts from organizations tracking supply at the source level. The timing is not coincidental. Multiple categories are under pressure simultaneously, and the effects will work through to retail pricing and availability over the coming months. Build deliberately. Stock what actually works in real cooking situations under real conditions. Rotate what you buy so nothing expires unused, and do not wait until the situation is obvious and widely discussed before you act. By the time a supply problem is obvious to everyone standing in the grocery aisle, the straightforward and affordable options are already the ones that are gone. The people who acted earlier, with better information and a clearer strategy, are the ones who are not standing in that aisle wondering what to do next. If this video was useful, take a second and hit like. Leave a comment below telling us what you are stocking first. And if you want to keep seeing content built on real data rather than recycled guesswork, subscribe to my channel. New videos come out regularly, and every one of them is grounded in the same kind of specific sourced information you just watched. See you in the next one.